Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
This story begins quite early in the morning when the girl who was sleeping peacefully in her room had her alarm clock ring, as always. It was quite difficult for her to wake up because she had drunk a little too much alcohol the night before, so now she had a hangover. But when the girl finally opened her eyes, she saw not a window, as usual, but a naked man lying right in front of her. The girl immediately recognized who it was. This man's name was Yazyun, and she screamed loudly and jumped away from him, asking why he was in her bed at all. The guy, who had been sleeping quite soundly all this time and had not even woken up by the alarm clock, gradually began to open his eyes. Then he moved closer to the girl and, putting his arms around her waist, hugged her, and also wished her good morning. He moved a little higher, and laying his head on her chest, said that he was very comfortable like that, and also added that he needed to sleep like that at night. Of course, the girl was furious about everything that was happening. She screamed so loudly that some of the neighbors who lived in other rooms heard this scream. Yazyun felt uncomfortable, so he moved away from her and even scratched his ear because her voice was really very loud. But at that moment, the girl began to cover her shirt so that he would not see anything, and asked if it was really he who undressed her. Then the guy turned his gaze to her and, smiling, said that she had complained last night that it was hot, and that was why she had taken it all off herself. When he sat up in bed, he said that besides everything, he tried to help her put on her pajamas, but she resisted for a very long time. But when she fell asleep, he did it. Last night, Sunhao had a really good time and drank a little too much, and the man had to take her back to her room. She clung to him all the time, and when they approached the bed, the girl became so bold that she even grabbed his hand so hard that he could not get out. The guy didn't even have time to understand what had happened before he found himself on the bed, and Sunhao jumped on top. The girl was wearing a rather beautiful tight evening dress, and her whole face was red from the alcohol, and she was actually swaying, but she managed to find her coordination and grabbed the guy by the hands. Yazyun lay and simply looked at the girl in surprise, not understanding what she was doing at all, because he certainly did not expect such a turn of events. The guy thought that he would simply accompany her to her room and then leave, but then such things started happening that he changed his mind. He looked her straight in the eyes, smiled and said that she was the first to climb into his arms, so later, when the influence of the alcohol wore off, he wanted her not to blame him for everything. Sunhao completely ignored his words and told him to shut up, and also called him her dog. The guy, of course, did not expect to hear such a phrase and asked again what she meant, but the girl then beamed with joy and continued to call him a dog. Sunhao rushed to hug him very tightly and said that he was very fluffy, like a dog. She lay motionless for a while, then approached his lips to kiss them, but did not dare. The guy certainly liked what was happening, and he smiled and asked her what she wanted to do now. The girl didn't have time to answer because she immediately began to kiss him passionately on the lips. Yazyun felt uncomfortable for a while, but when he realized what was happening and what would happen next, he continued to kiss the girl back, and they could no longer tear themselves away from each other. Their lips touched again and again, only pausing for a moment to take a few breaths. Both of them blushed because of the high tension in the room. Yazyun turned to her and was about to interrupt all this, but the girl was not going to stop. He said that if she continued like this, he simply would not be able to bear it. But then Sunhao suddenly interrupted his story. She was so ashamed to even think about it that she screamed loudly and asked him to stop. The girl froze like a statue and could not believe that all this was really happening. Yazyun was, in turn, very pleased. He smiled again and asked if she had finally remembered everything. In order to somehow dilute their awkward silence, he smiled and said that last night she was absolutely on top of her game, and he wouldn't mind repeating it all. As soon as the girl heard these words, she immediately returned to normal. She grabbed a pillow and, hitting him, told him to shut up. Sunhao blushed again. She sat there and wondered why everything had come to such a terrible turn of events, because before she could not even imagine that this could happen. And it really was like that. 2 months ago, the girl attended a very important event at the Grand Hotel. Namely, it was a banquet in honor of the signing of a cooperation agreement between Fidi Capital and Yunding Group. Yazyun was the executive vice representative of the board of directors and CEO of Fidi Capital. At that event, they met in person for the first time, and the man, turning to Miss Song, asked when they would officially become spouses. The girl standing next to him with a glass of red wine was the general director of the Yunding Group, and in fact, Sunhao Hao. Smiling, she turned to Mr. Yan and asked him if he thought it was appropriate for them to get married since they addressed each other in this way. The guy was a little surprised and pretended not to understand what she was talking about. Then Sunhao explained that Yunding and Fidi Group had been in partnership for 5 years. They were responsible for developing the client base, and the man handled exclusive sales and payments. She looked quite serious and said that they were grateful to his group for helping them start the collaboration, so the profits were always split in half. And so it was completely unclear to her why he was so fixated on the insignificant terms of this very mutually beneficial partnership. Sunhao said that, after all, he had not taken part in those negotiations and had never even met her. The guy, who was also holding a glass of red wine in his hand, asked how she could call them insignificant. Then he asked if maybe she just didn't understand which of the conditions was additional, and that's why she was saying such things. Sunhao, as soon as she heard all this, became very angry. She thought that he was a real dog because he did not give a single answer, but only asked leading questions. The guy, meanwhile, seeing her angry expression, said that when Yunding was in a critical situation, Fidi made a condition that she, as Miss Song, must marry him. Marriage was his most important goal, and saving Yunding was just an additional condition. Yazyun began to put everything in its place and said that she looked at his photographs, video presentation, and gave her written and verbal consent to this condition. Smiling, he moved closer to her and said that he very much hoped that now that her company was thriving, she would not go back on her words. As soon as the girl heard all this, she was shocked. For some time, she was simply silent, because she did not know how to react to this. However, she then turned to Mr. Yan and said that he understood perfectly well what situation her company was in at that time. And to be honest, for the sake of saving Yunding, not only would she marry him, she would even agree to marry a dog without hesitation, because it was very important to her. Yazyun was a little surprised when he heard this, but then he continued to smile and said that the situation had now become quite interesting. The girl explained that she had not at all taken back her words, but that it had only been their first meeting, and asked if he had thought that the talk about marriage had been too hasty. Sunhao even said outright that she had never been attracted to men, and such conversations at the first meeting also did not help this. Yazyun, hearing this, immediately latched onto the words and said that this meant that she had never had a lover, and for him this was simply wonderful. But the girl was not going to be ashamed of it. She said that she has a very difficult character, and she is domineering and is never gentle and caring, which is simply necessary for a relationship. She has a lot of shortcomings, so she definitely can't find a candidate for this position, and she didn't see the need for it. Yazyun, hearing this, immediately said that this was just great. After all, he was already beginning to worry that if she turned out to be so perfect, it would be very difficult for her to accept him. Songhao was shocked. She didn't understand how this scoundrel could change so quickly, and thought that his words were somehow sincere. But the guy didn't miss the opportunity. He spoke to her again, saying that now that they had a prenuptial agreement, he would call her his darling, and she could call him her beloved. Laughing awkwardly, he also added that if beloved wasn't right for her, she could just call him husband. That would also be appropriate. But his worst suggestion was that she could call him daddy, and that definitely drove the girl crazy. But she managed to control her emotions in time. Songhao, moving closer to him, asked with a smile on her face, "Does he really want to take her as his wife?" At that moment, the guy was really sincere, and he said very confidently that of course he wanted to do it. The girl, hearing this, was a little disappointed, but immediately asked if there was some hidden reason for such great zeal for marriage with her. He, still smiling, said that it was more likely no than yes. He just wanted to do it, and that was it. As soon as the girl heard this phrase, she immediately imagined a Doberman in his place, which he looked incredibly like at that moment. Of course, Songhao had great disdain for this man himself, so she didn't say anything else, but just stood there with a sad expression on her face. When she attended this meeting with her future husband, all her expectations were met. He turned out to be a lying scoundrel, as she had assumed. In fact, Songhao was 24 years old, and there was a legend in their family that their ancestor was a great shaman who possessed incredible abilities. These abilities were linked to heaven and earth. However, over the centuries, the hereditary transmission weakened, and the bloodline lost its former strength. Some of the family's descendants occasionally developed minor abilities, but they were often bizarre and even unpredictable. For example, the ability to blink at such an incredible speed that no one noticed, or to find the most disgusting restaurants and order the worst dish there. Of course, it was difficult for the girl to judge whether it was all luck or, on the contrary, misfortune, but one day she was able to win the lottery. The ability she inherited was that if a man spoke to her and lied, he would immediately take the form of a dog. Ever since she was a child, Songhao had been able to discern this ability, especially when it came in handy in situations where men confessed their love to her or spoke of their sincere intentions. Luckily, this only affected men and only happened when they were interacting with her. However, this ability had taken away all interest in the opposite sex. But now, when Songhao stood in front of her future groom, who said he wanted to marry her, she saw him in the form of a dog. The girl understood perfectly well that he was brazenly lying to her face, although he did it quite skillfully. If it weren't for her ability, she wouldn't have even guessed. The next day, Song Hao was working in her office from early morning. As the CEO, she was completely immersed in her duties, of which she had many. While sorting through the papers, Song Hao turned to her assistant Yang Yi, saying that she had left a list of 25 international investment bank stocks, and each of them needed to be shorted by 1% of assets. The assistant, after listening to the instructions, immediately assured her that the request would be fulfilled. However, the girl did not finish the conversation. She added that after the release of financial reports for the second quarter for all companies, the number should be reduced to 6, including Daring Technology. Yang Yi was sincerely surprised to hear such an instruction, but firmly promised to complete everything on time. Just as Song Hao was about to give her more additional tasks, someone knocked on the door of the office. Instant entered Secretary Eileen. She reported that Chairman Wenzhou had already arrived and was waiting outside the door. The guy, without waiting for an answer, opened the door slightly and turned to his sister, asking what she was doing. That man was Wenzhou, chairman of the board of directors of Yunding Group. But the girl, not paying attention to him, snapped that she was very busy, and if he had business, then he should speak faster. At that moment, she handed Yang a folder of papers so that her assistant would not be delayed and would quickly begin carrying out her instructions. Joe came closer and, handing over a beautifully wrapped box, asked if he couldn't just come to her without a special reason. He looked a little sad and admitted that he just wanted to see her, while also bringing her favorite cake. The girl, of course, understood that this was not without reason and was about to yell at him, but the guy got ahead of her, covering her mouth with his hand. Joe came even closer, and she noticed a faint glint of violet in his blue eyes. This surprised her greatly, because they had never been so close before. This moment suddenly ended with his hysteria. He began to beg her not to throw him out and to let him stay in the office for a little while. When his tantrum was over, he wiped away his tears, smiled, and asked if she would mind if he stayed. Song Hao was very angry that he was distracting her from her work. She pushed him away and sternly told him to stop, as she still had many tasks to complete. Then the guy, sighing heavily, asked if she accidentally considered him annoying. The girl was immediately very surprised when she heard this, and asked where he could get such thoughts, because he is her younger brother, and she, of course, cannot consider him annoying in any way. She explained to the guy that he himself knows the situation in their company very well. So now it is especially necessary to strengthen the developments. This is a very important point, and she simply does not have time for any extraneous nonsense. At first, Ju was very upset and remained silent for a while, but then, looking at her with hope, he asked if she would like to have dinner together in the evening. For Song Hao to say this, because she knew very well how sensitive her brother was, but she replied that she already had an appointment with Mr. Yan from the feedy company that evening. But as soon as the boy heard this name, he immediately became very serious and even angry. He told his sister to stay away from this man. Ju explained that this guy is definitely not a good guy. He also added that Feedy decided to profit from other people's problems. He is irritated by the fact that they are already using their profits, and now they want to take it away for themselves. To happen under any circumstances. He would do everything in his power to prevent this from happening. As soon as his sister saw such behavior, she was truly horrified. She had never seen her brother display such rude emotions, but she came to her senses pretty quickly and told him not to say such things, because at that critical moment, it was Feedy who helped them. The distribution of profits did not change, so it cannot be said that they were profiting from them. But the guy continued to insist on his own and said that she should not marry him under any circumstances, because if she did this, he simply did not know how he would live on. Song Hao smiled and said that the company was developing steadily and confidently, and he had long been able to cope with the necessary work on his own. Therefore, she did not see any problem in all this. Ju then very confidently told her dear little sister not to marry him, but rather to stay with him, said that he would always be there and would never betray her. At that moment, saying these words, he looked straight into her eyes, ruffled his hair and told him not to joke, because she was dating him simply to see if there was a way to change this condition somehow. In that at all, so he shouldn't worry. Disappointed, because she said that she was not going to even think about such a topic. When evening came, Song Hao had a rather tense meeting with her future fiancé. They were sitting in a restaurant and talking about something, when suddenly, Yaz Yun became very angry, and slamming his hand on the table said that he was already 24 years old. He looked at the girl almost with hatred and did not understand how she could have such a calm reaction, thinking that this would be the best way to say something. The guy didn't have a birthday that day. He only said this because he urgently needed to get married. So he came back closer to the girl and said in a very angry voice that this was not something that could be negotiated at all. It was a mandatory condition from which he was never going to retreat. He also said that if she didn't fulfill her promise, then he could easily destroy her company Yun Ding, which he saved. As soon as Song Hao heard this, she immediately became very angry because she did not like being manipulated and asked again what he was saying. A real bastard, and also couldn't believe that he was going to propose to her in such a way. Idiotic Doberman with protruding ears and that he knew absolutely nothing. As soon as the guy heard that she called him a Doberman, he was very surprised and could not understand how she could even know about it. Song Hao was so angry at that moment that she looked more like a tiger, growling at its poor victim than an ordinary girl. Yazyun felt a little uneasy about the whole situation. He even began to tremble with fear. But then he said very quietly that, in principle, he should have expected this, because she was a true descendant of a shaman. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately realized that she had crossed the line. She quickly sat back down on the chair and, giggling, said that she had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Also said that she had absolutely no idea that any shamans existed, so she asked him not to make things up. Yazyun, having slightly lowered his tie because it was beginning to choke him, said that he would not insist because they both had little secrets. The girl didn't answer. She just sat and looked at him in surprise, not knowing what would happen next. But the guy suddenly looked her straight in the eyes and said that he knew that she had secrets and he could honestly share his little secret with her. Song Hao, hearing this, was a little surprised because she never thought that he could make special inquiries about her, gain her trust, allegedly revealing some secrets, order to be honest with each other. He wanted to ask her something, and then Yazyun whispered in their ear what they would do that day. Would he go to her or would she go to him? Shocked that she simply sat in place for a while. But then she took the plate of food that was in front of her and, throwing it right in his face, sent him away for such phrases. Immediately after this meeting, she went to her home to rest a little after a hard day. However, something unusual happened there. A monster appeared right in front of the girl, and she was shaking with fear, not knowing what to do. Descendant of a shaman, and he did not understand why she was still surprised by such simple things. Without thinking twice, when this monster began to approach, she immediately began to run away screaming because she was really scared, and she did not know what to do in such a situation. And this creature turned out to be much faster. It grabbed her leg and, smiling maliciously, suddenly asked if Miss Song accidentally thought that he had saved her company out of pure altruism, and in fact her future husband. Past and the shamanic blood had weakened, there must still certainly be something in her that distinguishes her from all other ordinary people. Yazyun was completely unlike himself. His eyes were filled with black, and he held the girl very tightly, saying that he had already entrusted her with his secret, so now it was her turn to say what secret she was keeping. The guy even had small fangs showing when he opened his mouth. However, Song Hao was so scared that she couldn't even withstand all this pressure. The girl simply lost consciousness right in his arms, and the guy did not understand what was happening. Some time had passed since then. He laid the girl on the sofa so that she would wake up faster, and even covered her with his jacket. Song Hao was unconscious for quite a long time, and all this time she was thinking about the situation she saw before falling asleep. The girl could not believe that her future groom could actually transform, and she did not know what was going on at all. However, she understood that since he had opened up to her, he certainly had nothing to fear. But she was most interested in what this man really had in mind, and what he wanted from her, and also why he insisted so much on marriage. Then suddenly the girl heard his voice, which was addressing her, and he said that her pulse had become faster and her temperature had risen a little. He could clearly see that she was already awake, so she shouldn't pretend anymore. As soon as the girl heard this, she immediately realized that there was no point in pretending anymore. She sat up on the bed and asked who he really was, a man or a monster. Yazyun, who had been standing next to her all this time, sat down on the sofa next to her and said that, of course, he was a human being. If he was already tired of explaining all this, and said that he was simply an unusual person with his own peculiarities. When he saw the surprised expression on her face, he added that he would explain everything so that there would be no misunderstandings later. He explained that his mother was a descendant of an ancient family, and that family was bound by the oldest and most powerful curse. According to the curse, in every generation, one of their descendants, upon reaching adulthood, gains the ability to transform into a dog. This ability cannot always be controlled. Sometimes it can get out of control, and a person turns into an animal against his will. Sun Hao, hearing this, began to tremble and asked, does he really want to tell this whole story that he is a wolf? A dog, which was probably quite large in size. He also said that in order to remove the curse, he needed to marry a woman in whose veins the blood of a shaman flows. He looked at her even with some admiration and said that she was precisely the power that he had been looking for all his life in order to finally get rid of this terrible curse. Sun Hao, hearing this, now understood everything. She wondered, was this the reason he was so insistent on getting engaged and married to her? Smiling happily, the guy said that everything was so, and then added that in that case she would be able to help him remove the curse, and then he would finally be free. The girl had already become more courageous. She looked at him with irritation and asked, "What does this have to do with her at all? After all, his freedom is his own business. She will not benefit from it in any way." Buried in all this, because as it turned out, he simply wanted to use her for his own benefit. Yazyun said that once he lifted the curse, they could immediately get a divorce, because marriage was just a formality. It could be considered that she was just helping him, that's all, a friendly request. Then Sun Hao, to make sure, started asking him various questions, such as, is he going to drink her blood, and is he going to tie her to a tree and burn her? Told her with confidence that they would definitely be able to get a divorce after this, but the girl still did not trust him. She remained silent for a while, then, smiling, asked, "Is it really that simple?" And she also said that she really hoped that he was not hiding anything anymore. Yazyun felt a little uneasy, and immediately said that he really had no more secrets. But even with the naked eye, one could see that he was lying. And since the girl had special abilities, she immediately saw that he had turned into a Doberman, so she became very angry. Sun Hao came closer to him and, pointing her fist, said that he was lying again and asked, does he really want her to turn him from a Doberman into an ordinary Chihuahua? As soon as the guy found out that she somehow figured out that he was lying, he was very surprised and did not understand how this was possible. He took her hand and said that, in fact, it was not a secret at all, but explained that in order to break the curse, it was necessary for those entering into marriage to truly love each other. He came closer to her and said that he would very much like her to think about it and give her answer immediately. Sun Hao quickly pushed him away and asked, "What real love?" She replied that this was too much of a pre-wedding requirement. Could just stay in this form forever, because she didn't see anything bad in it. She also said that if things were too hard for him, she could support him as a thank you for his help with the company. As soon as the guy heard this, he was surprised. Then he moved even closer to her and told her to believe him. He saved her company because he sincerely wanted to help and not to use her. Yazyun came up with a very suitable solution and suggested that she give him a chance and they try to live together for a while. He was even ready to swear that he was not planning anything bad and that he was not breaking their rules. Of course, in his head he was thinking that he wouldn't give up so easily. The guy was saying that if she still didn't want to marry him, he promised not to force himself on her anymore. However, Sun Hao clearly saw how he transformed into the form of a dog when he said such words. The girl couldn't believe that he lied again and asked, is he really going to continue lying in the same spirit? This was already starting to irritate her. But he, smiling, asked, how can she say such things? Because in order to marry her, of course, it was necessary to lie, but it was all only for the sake of their happiness. Sun Hao sighed heavily, then asked him to show her again how he transformed into his dog form. The man, of course, agreed to this without hesitation, and immediately, with the power of thought, turned into a small Doberman, who looked straight at the girl with his purple eyes. She began to look attentively at the guy in the form of a dog. For some time she didn't even say anything, began to rub his muzzle against her. She said that he really was as handsome as in his real form. Yazyun was delighted by these words, and immediately began to lick her face as a sign of affection. But the girl suddenly grabbed him by his little muzzle and said that since he had saved the company, she would definitely repay him for it. Tomorrow, they would go to formalize the marriage and break his curse. As soon as he heard this, he was delighted. He looked at her in surprise and tried to understand what the catch was, because he knew perfectly well that she could not agree to this so quickly. He was in no position to refuse so easily, so the next day they went to a photo shoot, told the girl to smile and watch her facial expression, and also told them to move closer because they were far apart. In fact, the bride and groom were dressed quite elegantly. The girl was wearing a beautiful wedding dress, holding a bouquet of white flowers, and Yazyun was wearing an expensive tailcoat. The photographer approached Sun Hao, told her to move her head a little closer to the man. The girl felt very uncomfortable, but she even told herself that she only needed to get a little, because as soon as they received a marriage certificate, destroying this curse, then everything would end forever, and she would no longer have any contact with him. And so when a whole day had passed and they already had a marriage certificate, when they returned home, the guy still turned into a dog. Sun Hao looked at him in surprise and asked, "Wasn't this marriage supposed to dispel his curse?" She was simply desperate. He said that he said all this with such confidence, but in the end he made her look like a real idiot. She married him, and the curse didn't even go away. For a while the girl just sat there and was silent. Then she grabbed his furry muzzle, pulled it closer to her and started screaming, saying that she was a real fool for believing his words. She was hysterical. The girl even started having a panic attack, because she had never been in a relationship before, and now she was a married woman. But it still did not give any result. When Yazun transformed back into a human, he tried to calm her down and said that he had deep feelings for her, but she was completely indifferent to him. He said that this was probably why the curse had not been lifted. The girl sighed heavily at that moment and realized that he had probably been telling the truth when he had warned her that they should have feelings for each other. Yazun was surprised. He began to button his shirt and asked how she knew that he was telling the truth, because he thought that she would not believe him again. Of course, the girl couldn't tell him that she believed him because his head hadn't become dog-like again. She didn't want to reveal her secrets, so she simply changed the subject. Sun Hao smiled and said that she wanted to know what kind of deep feelings they were talking about. After all, they had only met a couple of days ago, so these feelings certainly couldn't have arisen so easily. The guy was incredibly serious at that moment and said that in fact he had already managed to notice her a long time ago. Yazun also looked a little sad, saying that she just didn't know about it, but he had real feelings for her. Then the guy, moving closer to her, asked if she remembered that press conference of her company, which was about a few years ago. In fact, she was standing on stage then in a black elegant dress with her hair up and a small white flower in it. As soon as the girl heard this, she was incredibly surprised, because many years had passed since that moment, and he still remembered even how she was dressed. Son. It took Hao a moment to remember. She knew it was the press conference after her dad and uncle's accident. It was the hardest period of her life. She had to perform in front of a lot of people, as well as cameras, but she was definitely not mentally prepared for it. The guy sitting down next to her said, looking the girl straight in the eyes, that then her face was very pale, her eyes were red from tears, but her gaze remained unusually firm and self-confident. And then she said with complete confidence in her voice that she was still there, and as long as she was alive, her company would definitely not fall. Yazun, hearing this, immediately understood at that moment that the girl's fragility, but at the same time her resilience merged into one in her. And then his youthful heart immediately began to beat much stronger, because he realized that she was his ideal woman, the one with whom he was ready to spend at least an eternity. Now Sun Hao, hearing about all this, even felt a little embarrassed. In fact, she didn't know that he was also present at that conference that evening. The man took her hand, and pulling her closer to him, said that from that time on there was only her in his heart. As soon as Sun Hao heard this, and immediately began to look closely at his face, and noticed that the guy had not turned into a dog's head. This meant that everything he said was true, but she quickly pushed these thoughts away, because she understood that she would definitely not be able to pull herself together in this way. True feelings must be tested by a special test of fidelity. She shouldn't show her weakness, because she had already let him deceive her and eventually became his wife. So from now on, the girl had to act very carefully. So, after being silent for a while, Sun Hao turned to him and said that he spoke, of course, very beautifully, but she wondered what to do with the last 5 years that had passed since then. The girl could literally feel her whole face turning red, and it really irritated her, so she tried to calm down and collect her thoughts. Yazun, hearing this, explained that after the engagement, he would go to another country to transfer to another university and return to find her. However, he then had an accident, and for this reason spent several years in hospital. As soon as Sun Hao heard this, and was very surprised, she asked in a worried voice, "Does this mean that he has been suffering all this time?" She also asked how he was feeling now, because she was worried. But the man, smiling, said that he was already completely fine, and if she did not believe him, she could personally look at everything. At this moment, Yazun pulled up his hand in his shirt and immediately tensed his arm, showing off his biceps, and the girl didn't even look away. She noticed that he had very strong arms with well-defined muscles and visible veins under the skin. Without thinking twice, she reached for his hand and immediately began to touch his muscles. The man, of course, did not expect this, so he was even very surprised when she did this. But at that moment, when the girl touched his hand, he felt very pleased, so he decided not to disturb such an intimate moment and simply remained silent. Sun Hao, who continued to hold his hand, noticed that they had incredible strength, and this really inspired and even surprised her. For a while, she just stood there and held his biceps, but then the man turned to her and wanted to say something in a surprised voice, but he didn't have time because she seemed to have been burned and took her hand away from him. Sun Hao herself did not understand what was happening to her and why she suddenly approached him like that, because it was too thoughtless an act. Even though his muscles were really strong, she felt uncomfortable because she even blamed herself for doing this. Yazyun decided to tease her a little. Moving closer to the girl, he smiled and asked if she really liked it all that much. But then he smiled and said that if she really liked it, she could feel free to touch the muscles in other places. Then he opened his shirt a little, and his muscular and pumped-up chest appeared from there. The girl immediately became indignant. Her face became even redder. She moved away from him, asked what he was saying, and also said that she didn't like it one bit. But at that moment, the man began to run his hand over her cheek and said in a thoughtful voice that if he could, he would like to spend every day with his bride and not waste all these long years that had passed. Every day he felt like this loss would kill him, but he fought the thought that he would one day be able to return to her again. She didn't respond to this, but only looked away from the man, because she understood that if she continued like this, she would do something that she would regret even more. She pulled his hand away from her and said that, of course, it all sounded very nice, but in fact, she was not a bride at all, just a key to dispel his spell. She knew perfectly well that any man's words were a deception, and there was always a lie hidden behind them, so a girl should never allow herself to fall for this. She pointed to his passport and said that the marriage papers were already prepared, and she fulfilled her promise. However, the curse did not disappear, which means that she does not have the necessary power to do this, and he was simply mistaken. Sun Hao strongly recommended that the man simply turn to someone suitable for all this, because, as practice showed, she was completely unsuitable for this. But Yazyun, of course, was not going to act on her recommendations. He looked at her with a smile and said that he had revealed the family secret to her, and now she was on this ship with him forever. And that's why she won't be able to just walk away after receiving the red marriage document. Now she'll have to put in a lot of effort to do it. As a result, the girl had no choice and stayed the night in a hotel with her now husband. As always, her alarm clock rang at the same time. She mechanically turned it off and immediately left the room. Sun Hao didn't even notice that the man was sitting in the living room. She walked into the bathroom with half-closed eyes to wake up a little. The girl, having washed her face, immediately began to brush her teeth and, looking at herself in the mirror, noticed that she looked as if she had been drinking alcohol all night without stopping. But at that moment, a rather large Doberman suddenly entered her bathroom, holding a towel in his teeth. He came so close to the girl that she even got scared. For her, of course, this was all a big surprise. So she spat out the water that she had taken into her mouth to rinse the toothpaste straight onto the man, who at that moment was in the form of a dog. Yazyun sat very surprised but did not answer or react in any way, and the girl, screaming very loudly, asked what the dog was doing in the bathroom. It just took her a while to remember who he was, so after taking a closer look, she asked, "Is that Mr. Yang?" and also asked him to forgive her for what happened. Of course, Sun Hao couldn't believe that she had actually forgotten that he had moved in with her, and that he had such a peculiarity. She knew he had definitely planned this a long time ago because he looked very pleased when he told her the news. Sun Hao couldn't even terminate this contract, because it would simply be a big blow to her. The girl believed that perhaps if she treated him coldly, he would leave her alone, and she at least really hoped for this. With a false smile, the girl said that she really thought about his well-being, and if she could not remove the curse from him, then of course she would interfere with him in this matter. She had said this on their first wedding day. She suggested setting a month's time limit and seeing what would come of it. If the curse was lifted, then naturally everyone would be happy about it, but if not, then he wouldn't be able to lift it, at least not together with her. She understood that regardless of the outcome, they would have to get divorced in a month, so this option suited Sun just fine. How? The man, hearing this, asked how she could offer only a month, because it was too little. So at least a year or a year and a half was needed so that they could live together and understand everything. The girl doubted for some time, but then said that 3 months would be her limit, and she would not make any other concessions. She also said that if he absolutely did not agree to this, then the next day they would file for divorce at the registry office. She explained that her firm would have other ways to express their recognition, so it was not necessary to focus on just one. The man thought about it for a while, but then he sighed heavily and finally agreed, saying that let it be as she said. But then he moved closer to her and said that in order for them to communicate more conveniently during this entire time, he said that he would live with her, because otherwise they would definitely not be able to find a common language during such a period of time. Of course, as soon as the girl heard that he wanted to live in this place with her, she was not thrilled with the idea. But the man was surprised to ask how it could be otherwise. After all, they were both constantly at work, and they certainly wouldn't be able to develop a relationship if they didn't live together. Of course, Sun Hao knew perfectly well that he was right to some extent, but she was not at all used to living with someone. However, she had to agree to this, because otherwise they would not have found a common language. Then the man started to leave, and with a smile on his face said that he would go home, pack his things, and come back. But she suddenly stopped him. She explained that since they were going to live together, they needed to establish some very important rules that they would simply have to adhere to, and if he agreed to these conditions, then he could move in. In the end, they discussed everything, and the man really moved into her apartment. When Sun Hao finished her morning routine and sat on the sofa next to the man, asking him for forgiveness, she really hoped that he didn't notice what she called him at all. But then suddenly, while wiping his cute little face, she noticed something strange. The girl stopped and asked him why he was in the form of a dog. The man, of course, tried to answer this, but could only bark in response. Then Sun Hao remembered what he had said. The man had warned her in advance that due to a curse, he was forced to live like a dog for several days a month, and this was just one of those times. He told her not to be afraid when that happened, because in this state, he was definitely not harmful to others, so she should not worry. No, Sun Hao couldn't believe that it could happen so quickly, because he literally just yesterday talked about turning into a dog, but she didn't think that it would be from the very first day of their living together. The guy just waved his face at this, and after looking at her for a while, he suddenly turned away. The girl did not understand at first why this was so. However, having lowered her head down, she noticed that her robe had unfolded a little, and her chest with a nightgown was visible there. So, having quickly become worried, she covered everything up. She immediately hit him, asking where he had even removed his gaze. The guy did not expect this, so he did not even have time to dodge her blow. He fell onto the sofa unconscious, and Song Hao immediately realized her mistake and asked if he was okay, as she saw that she had overdone it a bit with her strength. When he finally regained consciousness, the girl began to wipe and stop his nosebleed, but continued to scold him, asking who allowed him to look everywhere and still call himself honest. Song Hao was very upset that he appeared without a sound, and she was very scared because of it. Afterwards, the girl said that she had heard people say that dogs had pretty strong heads, but she couldn't understand how he could even bleed from such a light blow. She was irritated by the fact that he was too fragile, and she pointed this out to him. Yazyun was very offended by this, and he suddenly began to growl at her, putting his paw on her hand, not understanding who she dared to call so fragile. The girl immediately thought that he was trying to get her attention, and stroking his face, asked if he was really in so much pain because she hit him. Then she began to move closer to him, as if she wanted to kiss him on the nose, and the man immediately felt very awkward about this and became embarrassed. But then suddenly, continuing to hold his head, she asked if he remembered the conditions that they had discussed the previous night before he agreed to move in with her. And as soon as the guy heard this, he immediately became wary, because he remembered these conditions very well, but he didn't really like them. However, he had no choice. He just had to agree to them, because otherwise she wouldn't agree to live with him.